My name is Kevin, and I'm here with Trevor and Jonathan. And today we will be discussing the relationship between two important texts. The first text is The Self-Preparing Robot by John W. Campbell, and the second text is Notary by John Michael Basquiat. Please take a quick look at at this chart. This is the structure of our presentation today. We will begin by our thesis, which discusses the contrasts between the two works. We will then introduce the two works, The Self-Preparing Robot by John Campbell and Notary by John Michael Basquiat. And then we will discuss the three contrasts that these two works have, followed by a conclusion that summarizes everything we've covered.
Now, our thesis and argument for this presentation is while optimism is generally viewed more positively than pessimism, Campbell's blind optimism, reflected in Self-Preparing Robot, is indicative of his ignorance of the effects of racism toward African Americans, whereas Basquiat's pessimism in Notary provides a more accurate perspective of racism's effect. Now, just to start, we're going to look at Self-Preparing Robot by Campbell. This story is about these crystals that can self-repair, and that whenever they are damaged, they can fix themselves. And these crystals are used to make a perfect being, a perfect robot, because any imperfections it has, because it's self-repairing, it can automatically correct them and make itself perfect again. Now, this is very science fiction, because this violates many laws that are commonly held today, like in chemistry and physics. But this science fiction style of writing was created, and it creates a more outlooking and positive view of how he views society should go. Now, Campbell himself, he was on the cutting edge of this style of writing. He was one of the first and pioneers to start writing about science fiction, and he was held highly because of this and praised because of this. But one aspect about him that wasn't praised as much was his racist views. He did have racist views, especially about African Americans and his views on slavery. And we can see this racism in his particular opinions and views about African slaves reflected in his broader themes of his stories, like Self-Preparing Robot.
So moving away from Campbell, this is Notary by John Michael Basquiat, and I just wanted you to take a minute to notice a few things about this. You might notice its disorganized state. I want you to notice maybe this black figure that's predominantly featured in the center here, and maybe notice that in fact these are three canvases that have been put together by Basquiat using a metal frame behind it, so we have one here, and one here. So just notice a few things about this, and we will come back and point out a few more things later on. So to talk a little bit about John Michael Basquiat, he actually started out at a very young age, the age of about 18 and even younger, as a street artist doing graffiti all over the New York City area with one other artist, and together they were called Samo. So this period of his life progressed till his early 20s when he started to collaborate with some more well-known pop artists such as Andy Warhol, and together they collaborated creating images and distorting images for various reasons, but primarily Basquiat did this to present a distorted vision of reality. And although he had a very successful career, Basquiat unfortunately died at a very young age due to a heroin overdose.
The first contrast that we'll be discussing between the works of Basquiat or Notary and the work of John W. Campbell or The Self-Preparing Robot is the themes present in these two works. In The Self-Preparing Robot, we have the theme of life, whereas in Notary we have the theme of pain and struggle. Let's begin with the motif of life in The Self-Preparing Robot. In The Self-Preparing Robot, Campbell constantly discusses about crystals that have the ability to recover from a crack or fissure. So if you were to make any crack or fissure within these crystals, over time these crystals would be able to go back to their original state. And another aspect of these crystals that Campbell discusses is that there's often the growth of an incorporation of parasitical crystals. In other words, we see how there are parasitical crystals that might grow on top of the original crystals. And originally, you may think that parasites are bad, but in this case, Campbell argues the fact that the parasites indicate a spontaneous creation of life. And we see how both recovery and parasitical crystals indicate the motif of life in the self-repairing robot. Now, on the other hand, in Notary, we have the motif of pain and struggle. As you can see from these few snippets from our painting, we see leeches, we see fleas, and we see dehydrated. And all these three words indicate life-draining forces. And of course, that brings back to the theme of pain and struggle. Another word you might see is Pluto. And Pluto can have, there are two interpretations for Pluto. The first interpretation is a corporation, which was considered to be an oppressive force, or the god of the underworld, so basically the god of life, of death and afterlife. And so both interpretations indicate the pain and struggle that Jean-Michel Basquiat was trying to depict in Notary. And we also see a little bit about the disorganization and layers of graffiti in Notary that again alludes to the fact that life is not simple. It is a mess, and thus life is pain and struggle.
To further elaborate on the disorganization in Notary, we can just look at it and we can understand that this is a very disorganized piece. It has various components that just seem not to fit in with each other, with just seemingly random objects just kind of thrown together. Now, this disorganization and general confusion that is portrayed with this painting gives the whole connotation of the African American communities and how they have dealt with pain and struggle through their oppression. Now, we can see this is very negative, and it is very sharply contrasting how Campbell's organized crystals, and this just shows the difference in views and how both artists view society different and how they view oppression differently.
So coming off of that, it's important to understand that Campbell's views in the context of reality are largely idealized. So starting with Andrew Pilch, he argues that Campbell believes there will be one environment incentivizing human mechanization. And what this means and what this relates to is that Campbell views the human form as it is now as part of a progression or a continuum which is going towards a more perfect state. And it does that by itself naturally. And continuing with this, we see the idea of a superhuman and how that's perpetuated in the self-repairing robot with the idea of self-repairing crystals and how those can be incorporated with other machines to create, or other biology in fact, to create a more perfect human. And this idea is largely spiritualist, but in reality it's a very technical, progressive view. So it's again idealized and not necessarily accurate of reality, as this is science fiction.
So you can see how the contrast between the motifs, that is the contrast between the motif of life and the motif of pain and struggle, easily reflects the contrast between positivity and negativity within these two works. We see how Notary views the environment as negative because of all the pain and struggle it depicts. And this is largely based on the fact that Basquiat has grown up with racism, and he has seen the destructive effects of racism on African Americans. And so that is why he depicts he has so much negative connotations within Notary. On the other hand, we see how the self-repairing robot, which constantly alludes to the theme of life, and as a result, we see how the self-repairing robot has a much more positive connotation as opposed to Notary. We see how the self-repairing robot wants us to try to strive for perfection, try to heal, and by doing so, by referencing these crystals that are able to always heal themselves. And this, the contrast between positivity and negativity can be reflected through the difference in their views. Basquiat's view is that slavery and racism has had a lingering negative effect on his life as an African American. And on the other hand, Campbell believes that slavery and racism was actually beneficial to the African Americans. He believed that it was a better alternative between it and having Africa stay untouched.
Now we can see this kind of viewpoint of Basquiat in the way he paints. When looking at Notary, we notice that the centerpiece of this painting is this black figure, and we as viewers can kind of interpret this as being the African. Now this is trying to elevate the status of Africans, because generally in society, the Africans aren't held at the center point of any society. Now we can also just look at the general context of the painting. We can see the white figure in the background could be almost represented as just a white person, and how they're in the background for the first time as opposed to always being in the front while the African is in the back. Now just again, this centerpiece of the African is good for trying to elevate the status of Africans, because this is one of the first instances because of Africans being in the centerpiece, because generally in society during this time they were very oppressed and had very little time in the center and in the spotlight.
So to talk a little bit more about Campbell's views, and actually through somebody who's met him, Joseph Green, we see that Campbell actually believes slavery wasn't a necessity. The Civil War did do away with it, but it would have happened naturally of its own volition. So we see Campbell talking about this, and we see how he believes machines are part of a natural progression, how they would have evolved past the point of slave labor and would have replaced slavery. And he sees this as a more natural way, but it would have led to a natural integration of slaves into the actual population, which would have been better for them and for society as a whole. It would have been a lot smoother transition. So this, we see, actually comes out of the environment they're in. This natural upgrade is better for everyone, and this continues with Campbell's views that everything happens naturally. Now, understanding that, we know the reality isn't as perfect. These things don't happen as easily and as perfectly as Campbell suggests that they do. So going along with that, we look at Campbell's upbringing. He was wealthy for the majority of his life. He didn't really face many serious struggles that a lot of other sections of society have had to face. So because of this, and because he's working in a genre that deals with either pessimism or optimism or utopia or dystopia, we see Campbell favors utopia. And throughout his work and throughout his career, especially in The Self-Repairing Robot, we see this. He writes all of this for the white community, and we see how his views reflect that. So his upbringing is reflected in his work. Everything's perfect. There aren't really too many problems, and everything progresses towards this natural perfection. We see that.
And so we can see how we discussed the contrast between positivity and negativity within these two works. The one interesting thing to note, though, is that Campbell's positivity is actually is negative, as opposed to Basquiat's pessimism, which is actually good. And the reason is because even though Notary is pessimistic, it discusses the reality of the situation. It provides awareness into the destructive effects of racism on African Americans. On the other hand, even though the Self-Repair Robot has is a lot more positive compared to Notary, it is so much more idealistic and rooted on ignorance. It does not provide the actual realities of the situations of current society.
Now we can see this challenging of the status quo in Basquiat's work in just general. Now, we're looking at the top right picture. It was a collaboration of Basquiat and Warhol, where they just take this Arm & Hammer logo and alter it, showing again that they're challenging the status quo, that this isn't just conventional art. Now, we can see the importance of challenging the status quo in a lot of his themes, like the theme of African American oppression. Now, this is a darker theme, which is very contrasting of the current status quo of uplifting society. Now, we can see one of the ways he does challenge the status quo in his artist style is this cutting and mixing. Now, we can see this very clearly in Notary. Again, it goes back to the whole disorganization in being the 3 panels. It's almost like he just got a bunch of different images and cut and mixed and pasted them back on this and called it Notary. Now, this disorganization, from the cutting and mixing, again shows the oppressions of African Americans result in their pain and struggling that they have faced from slavery even today.
So to go back to Campbell, we remember that his view is largely idealized. He likens chemistry to biology, which is a nice idea, but it's not based in fact, which makes sense given he works in the science fiction genre. So going along with this, we see the blurring of lines between science fiction and fact. It's a component of his work, but it comes out of his ignorance in relation to how society actually operates and the laws of fact. And he enjoys working in this genre, we see, because this view is easily perpetuated. So this ignorant is in fact negative because it holds no awareness for the realities of society or fact or whatever it may be. So going on from there, I'd like to conclude and summarize everything we've talked about. In Notary, we see pessimism, we see pain and struggle, we see the combination of disparate elements and how that affects the work. And on the other side of things, we have the self-repairing robot, which puts 2 things together, these chemicals and this crystal, and shows how it progresses towards a perfect, idealized object by itself as a result of nothing other than nature. But going back to Notary and Basquiat, we have the status quo and how it's challenged by this negative view, whereas Campbell is largely a positive view that holds basis in science fiction and not, in fact. On the other side, again, with Notary, we see this pessimistic view that he carries throughout his life and his work is more accurate. It is a better representation of his reality and society's reality as a whole. Whereas on the other side, Campbell's ignorance, his idealized view, which in fact is more ignorant of all these things that Basquiat is aware of, is dangerous. And it's dangerous because without an awareness for the reality of society, although this reality may be hard to comprehend and may not be a nice view, it's necessary, because if you don't know where or what the problems are, there's no way to change society or whatever it is for the better. So that is our presentation, and I hope you enjoy.